Good morning and welcome to the Global Current. I'm Alicia Sharabali.
And I'm Zach Kotz.
First up, we have an update on the unrest in Egypt from Olivia Colson.
Concerns over civil unrest in Egypt continue to mount as residents repeatedly defy government-imposed curfew and swarm the streets. This past week, President Morsi declared a state of emergency in 3 cities, calling in military forces to quell the protests. But as the riots gained steam throughout each day, the chief of Egypt's armed forces, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has warned that, if remained unchecked, the unrest could undermine the current government. The week of violent protests began last Friday, the second anniversary of Egypt's revolution. 7 people were killed when dissidents, aggravated by the slow pace of change, clashed with police. The turmoil intensified after a court sentenced 21 civilians to death. The men were convicted for their part in last year's deadly football riot, which killed 74 people. Survivors and witnesses of the riot argued that the verdict is unfair and politicized. Rather than condemning fans, critics demand that the police be held responsible for negligence. Immediately after the verdict was released, thousands clashed with police in Port Said, the city where the football tragedy took place. Despite troop deployment, curfew continues to be ignored, and residents of Port Said have announced their nominal independence from Egypt. In an attempt to preserve order, Morsi declared a 1-month state of emergency and curfew in the most violent cities, invoking an authority reminiscent of the ousted President Hosni Mubarak. The state of emergency, which grants police the ultimate power to detain citizens and suspends ordinary judicial process, was a permanent staple of Mubarak's 30 years reign, before it was finally lifted in May of 2012. Needless to say, many Egyptians are not pleased to see it reenacted so soon. During an address on state television, Morsi said that he is only employing emergency measures for the good of Egypt, stating, "If I must, I will do much more for the sake of Egypt. This is my duty, and I will not hesitate." However, despite the military presence, unrest has continued. On Monday, Morsi called for leaders from all political forces to engage in a national dialogue to address the situation. However, Morsi's main opposition group, the National Salvation Front, refused to attend. The opposition group demands certain government concessions, such as the removal of the Constitution's religious character in exchange for their cooperation. Although Morsi stated that the meeting would take place without the attendance of the National Salvation Front, the opposition group has called for protests unless their conditions are met. Meanwhile, the clamor for change ringing through the streets is echoed in the worries of the freshly appointed authorities. As General Sisi made evident, change may result as a descent into chaos. The continuing conflict between political forces and their differences concerning the management of the country could lead to a collapse of the state and threaten future generations. This has been Olivia Colson from the Global Current.
Next, staffer Bilal Bahadur reports on the decision to prosecute a former Guatemalan dictator for genocide.
At a hearing Monday morning in Guatemala City, a Guatemalan judge said that there is enough evidence to charge former dictator Efrain Rios Montt with the murderous campaign that killed 1,771 indigenous Guatemalans from March 1982 to August 1983. The former dictator and his intelligence chief will both stand trial accused of genocide and crimes against humanity in connections with the mass massacres of the villagers. Quote, "The principal function of the state and its officials is to protest its citizens," said Judge Miguel Angel Galvez. According to the New York Times, the two were accused because they commanded the troops that killed 1,771 people in the Mayan Ixil region. Part of a decades-long running civil war, the campaign was allegedly carried out to gain control over the left-wing guerrillas. An Amnesty International researcher on Central America, Sebastian Algueta, said, quote, "This decision strengthens justice in Guatemala as accountability for past crimes begins to emerge." According to the BBC, General Rios Montt has been immune from prosecution for 12 years while he was serving as a congressman. This immunity was lifted January 14, 2012, when his term ran out. The general has since been under house arrest. According to BBC regional correspondent Will Grant, this ruling is a significant victory for human rights advocates who have been pressing for a trial since the end of the Civil War in 1996. Relatives of the victims of the massacre in western Guatemala waited outside for the word on the fate of the former dictator. Along with the 1,771 people who were massacred, some 29,000 families in the region were forced to live in inhumane conditions in the mountains. The initiatives for the prosecution are both a relief for the survivors that have been asking for justice for decades and human rights advocates all over the world. Reporting for the Global Current, Bilal Bahadur.
And now executive producer Zach Kotz on China's efforts to address pollution.
The sun was shining in Beijing today, but you wouldn't know it. Just being outside can make eyes itch and throats burn.
You feel like a little bit suffocated.
This could be my lung, tweeted one Chinese resident. And time-lapse photos showed how chemical clouds made buildings disappear.
The Chinese government began enacting emergency measures last week to begin combating hazardous air quality that has been criticized by international and domestic environmentalists alike. In the highest level acknowledgement to date, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao called for action to alleviate pollution that has led to hazardous air quality levels across much of China in recent weeks. Wen's comments may indicate concern among officials that the issue may become a political problem for the top leadership. Even lower-level government officials have been acknowledging the severity of the problem. Xinhua reported that Wang Anshun, the newly appointed mayor of Beijing, announced that the government had come up with a preliminary plan to curb pollution. Among the emergency measures put in place to combat the crippling smog are temporarily shutting down more than 100 factories and ordering one-third of all government vehicles off the streets. The measures come in response to increasingly panicked calls from international and domestic critics, including state-run media company Xinhua, to address growing concerns over the dangerous levels of smog that have engulfed much of northern China. Last Tuesday, airlines were forced to cancel flights from Beijing due to poor visibility caused by pollution in the air. This was the second time in 2 weeks that smog-induced cancellations hurt China's airline industry, which just began the 6-week peak travel season that surrounds the Chinese New Year, which falls on February 10th. Air quality concerns are nothing new for China. China has long adopted a grow-at-any-cost attitude towards strengthening its economy. Analysts speculate that the resulting environmental damage, which is now widespread and severe, will take years to clean up, even if serious measures are taken now. The United States monitors air quality with the aid of a sensor atop the American Embassy in Beijing, which reports data by utilizing the Air Quality Index standards set by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The AQI, which has an intended range of 0 to 500, registered a whopping 755 toxicity reading back on January 12th. The EPA considers levels between 301 to 500 to be horrendous, which alerts citizens to avoid all activities outdoors. The New York Times noted that the World Health Organization has its own standards that judge a score above 500 as more than 20 times the level of particulate matter in the air deemed safe. By comparison, the air quality index in New York City, using the same standard, was 19 at 6 a.m. last Saturday. Unlike episodes in the past where the government in Beijing has sought to sweep criticism under the rug, the worsening conditions have been subject to a surprisingly transparent discussion, even among state-run media. Beijing consultant and China watcher Jeremy Goldcom told The Times, quote, "I've never seen such a broad Chinese media coverage of air pollution. From People's Daily to China Central Television, the story is being covered thoroughly, without trying to put a positive spin on it." This has been Zach Kotz for the Global Current. Next, staffer Stephanie Parenti weighs in on Secretary Clinton's recent testimony before Congress over the Benghazi consulate attacks.
Madam Secretary, do you disagree with me that a simple phone call to those evacuees to determine what happened wouldn't have ascertained immediately that there was no protest? I mean, that was a piece of information that could have been easily obtained.
Well, but Senator,
within hours, if not days.
Senator, when you're in these positions, the last thing you want to do is interfere with any other process going
I
on.
realize that's.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came under fire from House and Senate Republicans for her testimony last week on the attacks in Benghazi. Senator Ron Johnson said the State Department was purposely misleading the American people. Senator Rand Paul told Clinton she should have been fired for not reading the cables from Stevens and others in Libya. Senator John McCain denounced the hearing, saying it was a cover-up from the beginning, and called Clinton's testimony unsatisfactory. Republican Representative Jeff Duncan accused Clinton of national security malpractice by letting the Benghazi consulate become a death trap. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was summoned to be questioned on the facts of the Benghazi attacks 3 months ago. The purpose of the testimony was to find out what happened, who was responsible that day, and if the correct steps were taken. Instead, it became a game of guess again, as Clinton was asked the same questions repeatedly, as the Republicans were unsatisfied with her answers. They were looking for something that would allow them to pin this horror on Obama's foreign policy. From Secretary Clinton's testimony, we learned that she actually dropped everything and put all her attention on the Benghazi attacks as soon as she found out about them, and in fact was working on embassy security before she received the news. Several other embassies that day were faced with masses of anti-American protesters against the anti-Islam video that went viral on the internet. In her words, crowds were trying to scale the wall in Yemen, Tunisia, as well as Libya. She was able to persuade the president of Tunisia to send reinforcements to their embassy there. But as she worked on the situations in Yemen and Libya, she got news on Benghazi. Immediately, she was in meetings with both her own staff and those of the corresponding embassies under attack. There were no delays in decision-making, no denials of support from Washington or the military, said Clinton. These two claims were verified in the report issued by the Independent Review Board.
So I think when you have a United States ambassador personally warning about the situation over there, sending this cable to your office,
if I could, 1.43 million cables a year come to the State Department. They are all addressed to me.
This is what the Secretary of State does. Information comes into the Department of State in waves and through bureaucratic channels. The cables asking for security boosts would never go directly to the Secretary. It would go through one of the other thousands of other civil and foreign service officers who would work at the desk of that country, individuals who don't have access to Clinton's door whenever they would like. The proceedings show extreme ignorance on matters concerning the protocol of Department of State by Congress. The real snake biting its own tail here is the fervor that the Republicans had while grilling the Secretary on security of the embassies, the security of which is rather expensive. The financing is provided by Congress, the same Congress where all the above-mentioned Republicans recently voted to cut the budget for diplomatic security. Representative Rand Paul said this was the worst tragedy since 9/11, which is an incredulous statement to compare this attack with one of that on our own soil where nearly 3,000 Americans were killed. In our history, U.S. embassies have been attacked 33 times, and currently there are at least 20 more embassies requesting more security. In Libya, there were 4 deaths, but in Yemen in 2008 there were 16. Attacks in Nairobi and Tanzania in 1998 left 224 dead. In Bogota in 1984 there were 24 killed, and the attack in Lebanon in 1983 left 64 dead. Clinton stated, "We operate in places where we know that our facilities are being surveilled for potential attacks, and we have a steady intel stream of plotting. It is a part of the job, but that is not to say that nothing will change. In fact, currently the State Department is rushing security requests through to the proper offices." An independent report from the State Department Review Board said it did not find that any individual U.S. government employee engaged in misconduct or willfully ignored his or her responsibilities leading up to the attack. Secretary Clinton was shown undue respect from the Republicans in Congress who have shown their ignorance on the protocol of State Department and its command and control operations, even after the Review Board confirmed all of Clinton's statements. Through their public rhetoric, their interviews, and their questioning during Clinton's testimony, they espouse the idea that Clinton and other members of the State Department are incompetent or irresponsible when it comes to protecting Americans. This is not only inaccurate, but it grossly misrepresents the work of civil and foreign service officers who work around the clock to protect U.S. citizens. I can only hope that this report has helped to set the record straight and clear the fog surrounding Secretary Clinton. This has been Stephanie Parenti with The Global Current.
And finally, staffer Adam Bergdorf on UNESCO's evolving response to damage of cultural heritage sites.
On Tuesday, January 29th, French troops pushed into the famed city of Timbuktu, Mali, and reclaimed it from the radical Islamists who had seized the city nearly a year ago. Unfortunately, this victory is not nearly as sweet as it might have been. In June of last year, the hardline Islamist group Ansar Dine, Defenders of the Faith, began destroying the famed tombs located within the city. Reports also surfaced that they had threatened to destroy Timbuktu's 14th century mosques, which were declared a World Heritage Site by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. As the Ansar Dine supporters left the city last week, they set fire to the Ahmed Baba Center for Documentation and Research, which housed over 20,000 scholarly works, some dating back to the 13th century. The reasoning behind this wanton destruction: Ansar Dine declares these sites to be promoting the worship of idols, and under their hardline interpretation of Sharia law, must therefore be destroyed. Unfortunately, this endorsement of cultural heritage destruction is an oft-repeated one. In November of 2012, radical religious leader Morgan Al-Ghouri shocked an Egyptian news program by calling for the destruction of the ancient pyramids and the Sphinx, saying, quote, "If it is a pagan statue or idol that is worshipped or suspected of being worshipped, or is worshipped by one person on earth, it must be destroyed. We, or someone else, must destroy it." This was also the motivation behind the Taliban's 2001 attacks on the Buddhas of Bamiyan, a pair of enormous Buddhist statues in Afghanistan dating back to the 1st century. The growing number of civil conflicts within states has also placed historically important sites directly into the path of destruction. During the Kosovo War, museums, monasteries, mosques, and other cultural artifacts were common targets of destruction in the process of ethnic cleansing. Historic sites are constantly under attack, as ongoing conflict in Syria has also claimed Aleppo's 17th century marketplace, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which caught fire during fighting in September of last year. Unfortunately, much of UNESCO's response to these losses have been limited to acting only after the destruction has occurred. For instance, UNESCO had been attempting to save the Buddhas of Bamiyan since 1997, when they were first threatened with destruction. It was only after the Taliban successfully blew up the statues that UNESCO finally passed the declaration concerning the intentional destruction of cultural heritage. But even then, the declaration placed the responsibility to act on the nations themselves, calling on all member states to increase efforts to secure their own cultural property and to prevent further losses. However, the more recent losses of cultural property have spurred UNESCO to take a more proactive approach, reaching out to involved parties the minute conflict begins. One such avenue of action has been for UNESCO to call upon the many treaties and conventions and attempt to convince conflicting parties to hold to the obligations held within. Speaking on the Syrian conflict, Veronique Daug, chief of the Arab States Unit of the World Heritage Center, explained some of this strategy.
Since months, UNESCO has been calling upon the concerned parties on the importance to preserve the heritage of the country. Syria is signatory to many of the UNESCO conventions, notably the 54 Convention on the protection of cultural heritage in the case of conflict, the World Heritage Convention. UNESCO is ready to go there as soon as the situation permits.
While this strategy is a good starting point, it is far from comprehensive. The 1954 Hague Convention Daug mentions most broadly covers international conflict, with only a single article asking that during internal conflict, both parties attempt to follow the treaty. Also, there is little way to monitor violations in these internal conflicts. As with the Syrian example, the veritable communications blackout has made it almost impossible to receive accurate and timely reports, much less follow up and properly investigate them. The ICC has also been asserting a stronger approach and appears to be re-examining policy to see what might be done to punish those who destroy these sites. ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda stated in regards to the Timbuktu destruction, quote, "This is a war crime which my office has authority to fully investigate." Although international law does not specifically single out the destruction of cultural sites as a war crime, the Rome Statute, of which Mali is a signatory, establishes that attacks on civilian buildings that are not military targets constitute a war crime. UNESCO is also developing more active responses. Addressing the destruction of Timbuktu's tombs in June, Irana Bokova explained what else UNESCO was doing.
And it's totally unacceptable what is happening there. What UNESCO can do, of course, it's appealing to stop this destruction. It's mobilizing support, international support of political, of religious leaders, so that all this tragedy, I believe this is a tragedy for the whole of humanity, stops.
In addition, UNESCO has been providing topographic features to the locations of Mali's culturally significant sites to aid military operations, as well as distributing brochures and information to individual soldiers to prevent further damage to these sites during conflict. UNESCO's emergency fund has also been activated so that steps can be taken to secure the cultural property as soon as the region is stabilized. While certainly little good can come from the destruction of our global heritage, perhaps a silver lining can be found in the fact that the destruction in Timbuktu may signal a shift to a more proactive and involved UNESCO in regards to protecting such historically significant sites, and a higher global awareness of the various dangers posed by these ongoing conflicts. This has been Adam Bergdorf, Global Current.
And now for our interview of today's program. We'll be speaking with Dr. Chris Ferrero, visiting professor at the Whitehead School of Diplomacy and International Relations, who will be featured in an upcoming panel titled Iran and the Nuclear Bomb. Join us at 2:30 p.m. this Thursday in the Chancellor's Suite of the University Center at Seton Hall University to attend this exciting panel event. So welcome, Dr. Ferrero. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome, Laura. Good to be here.
So I just want to get a little background on Iran and the nuclear bomb. The title of your upcoming panel. Can you tell us Iran's actions in the past that have led them up to this point with the potential threat of a nuclear bomb coming from them?
Sure. Well, it's a long story, both politically and technically, so I'll just give you the highlights. Iran started experimenting with nuclear enrichment under the Shah. And of course, this took on a very different political meaning when the Shah fell and the Islamic regime took over. Although during the 1980s, we didn't worry about an Islamic bomb in Iran because they didn't seem to be pursuing it. They were bogged down in a war with Iraq, and Ayatollah Khomeini said that it was against the strictures of Islam to pursue a nuclear weapon. Then after the Gulf War, 1991, which of course the proximate cause was Kuwait, but there was also concern about Iraq's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. A lesson drawn from that was that to beat the United States in a war, you would need a nuclear weapon, and Saddam didn't have that. That observation was made by an Indian diplomat. And you factor in that this was the end of the Cold War, and the United States defense establishment was looking out at the world trying to figure out what the next threat paradigm would be. And the rogue state paradigm emerged, and the suspicion that a country like Iran, like Iraq, would be the next generation threat to America, rogue states pursuing weapons of mass destruction, supporting terrorism. Now, the evidence of Iran actually pursuing a nuke is dubious. What has been technically problematic is their failure to be forthright in reporting their nuclear activities to the IAEA, because as a member of the non-proliferation regime, they do have a right to peacefully enrich uranium. But these activities are supposed to be monitored by the IAEA. And so the concern over the last couple of decades is that Iran has not been forthright, that secret facilities have been uncovered. The U.S. intelligence has found that Iran has not been fully reporting its nuclear activities. So this, of course, raises the question that, all right, why aren't they reporting what they're doing? There must be a nefarious intent. So that's where we are today.
Given their lack of reporting in the past, is it surprising to you that news has come out that Iran is now seeking 3,000 more centrifuges for their facilities?
No, I'm not surprised. They've made no secret of their plans over the last couple of years to continue with enrichment in the absence of any kind of agreement. They claim that they have peaceful intentions and reasons to do so. So the latest news isn't a surprise. I don't really think it's a game changer. You can ask the actual nuclear specialists who, from what I've read so far, have different opinions about how significant a step this is in technological terms. But no, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And Iran has been revealed to have been somewhat sneaky at times and to have hidden things, but in other respects, they're completely forthright with the fact that they are going about developing some sort of nuclear capacity. But nuclear capacity doesn't necessarily mean an ability to deploy a nuclear weapon. There's a difference between enriching uranium and actually dropping a bomb on a foreign city. More centrifuges, of course, could expedite their effort to get a nuclear bomb if in case they do have intentions to get a bomb. But number of centrifuges isn't the only important variable. It's also about the level of enrichment. So we're concerned about high levels of enrichment. 20% is still short of weapons-grade uranium, but it's too close for comfort as far as the technical experts are concerned. And you really only need to enrich uranium to 3 to 5% for the peaceful applications that Iran supposedly wants to pursue. So any agreement would be concerned not only with the quantity of centrifuges that are spinning, but the level of enrichment that is going on in those centrifuges. Now, we've been trying covertly in cahoots with Israel to sabotage their centrifuges. We had some success in that over the last couple of years. I don't know how long that will continue. Cybersecurity is or cyber attacks are a potentially dangerous can of worms to open up. So it's worth repeating that enrichment is certainly a step toward a bomb, but there are several steps left for Iran to go. So there is time to work this out still. Iran has, in the language of various analysts, been 5 years away from the bomb since 1992. So I would take with a grain of salt assessments you hear about the urgency.
Netanyahu famously drew his red line at the UN, saying that Iran would have a bomb at this summer at the earliest. So do you think it's more years off than that?
Well, the truth is I don't know because I don't have access to the intelligence. I think our government knows things that they aren't sharing with us. So I have to caveat this with the statement that this is educated speculation. There's concern, news reports in the last couple of weeks, that they've been developing some triggering mechanisms, and that's essential. You can enrich uranium till the cows come home, but if you have no way to actually deliver it and set off a nuclear detonation, you're not going to have a nuclear bomb. So there's some evidence that they've been doing that. They've also been developing their missile programs steadily over the last couple of decades. If they were able to put a nuclear warhead on a missile, they could plausibly threaten Europe and allies of ours in the Middle East, I think, within couple of years, but I don't get the sense that we are months away from an operational nuclear bomb. And most analysts don't think that Iran is actually trying to build and deploy a nuclear weapon. They want to have what is called a breakout capability. They want to have the knowledge and the infrastructure and the materials in place so that within a few weeks or a couple of months of a decision to do so, they could assemble and deploy a nuclear weapon.
Worldwide, there have been plenty of global non-proliferation efforts. Have these gone to any length at making Iran feel more comfortable or less threatened about the world they exist in?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, many people don't know this, not only committed non-nuclear weapon states to be non-nuclear weapon states, there's also a provision in there requiring the nuclear weapon states to make good faith efforts toward disarmament. So the Iranian argument within the context of the treaty would be, okay, yes, the United States has reduced its stockpile since the 1970s, but it's still not close to disarmament. And Iran is getting a bit of a raw deal. And moreover, they have said, now I'm not sure they really mean this, but the official stance of the Iranians is that they favor a nuclear weapons-free zone. And there are such things. For example, Central Asia has a nuclear weapons-free zone. And of course, in the Middle East, the main impediment to this would be Israel. It's an open secret that they have a nuclear weapon. So whereas the world's non-proliferation concerns are mainly focused on countries like North Korea and Iran, a logical, reasonable Iranian response would be, hey, maybe we want to have this capability because we see global nonproliferation not going very well, and we don't want to be the sucker. And that's a technical term in game theory, where you abide by an agreement and others don't. You get the sucker payoff.
Looking forward, where do you think this whole situation is going? Will the U.S. ever get over its political backlog to offer a hand in friendship out to Iran, or not even friendship, just diplomatic relations, or will this cat and mouse game continue?
Well, my hopes aren't high, but there is an opportunity coming in the next year. Ahmadinejad is going to leave office in August. They have a presidential election coming up this year. Moreover, their supreme leader is getting old. He could be around another 10 years. He could only be around another 10 months, though. So some leadership changes in Iran in the foreseeable future could provide an opportunity. But at the same time, we talk about this being an issue of great urgency, but there are a lot of international problems that we've learned to live with. We lived with the Soviet Union for a half a century. We have lived for the last few years with a nuclear North Korea. We have lived with the Israel-Palestine standoff. It's not optimal, but I could see this kind of tenuous status quo continuing because essentially we have Iran contained. I could see this going on for another 20 or 30 years. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Absolutely. Well, I just wanted to thank you. This has been Dr. Chris Ferrero of the Whitehead School of Diplomacy and International Relations joining us today, and we look forward to hearing more of your thoughts on the panel coming up this week.
Thanks, Laura. See you Thursday.
That's it for this week's show. I'm Alicia Sharabali.
And this is Zach Kotz. Thanks for listening to The Global Current. Be sure to visit us on the web at blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next week.